The wheels spun under the weight of soaked wood and battered canvas, each creaking turn sounding like a threat of collapse. The storm was already in the hills, and the bride, barely 20 and still smelling of sun-scorched linen and fear, was trying to position the strange contraption at the highest point of her claim before the wind found her. The wagon was her bedroom now, her only room in truth. They called it foolish. They called her that too. But the truth of it was simpler than the laughter made it sound. She hadn't come west for comfort. She'd come for the man who promised to build it with her, and he'd been buried 5 weeks before the first frost. They'd married out of a mail-order courtship. Letters, some exchanged through the preacher, others through the general store. No photographs, just faith. Jacob Rensley was older than she'd expected, almost double, but kind, and with hands hard from the axe and hammer. He'd already begun a cabin when she arrived, though the logs weren't pinned and there was no roof. She had no dowry, no furniture but what the wagon carried. And then came the fever. It burned through him in 4 days. She tended to him until he couldn't speak, then sat with him through the night as he faded, a cloth pressed to his head, prayers pressed to her teeth. The other settlers said it was the bad water from the well he'd dug too close to the cow pen. When she buried him, herself, no neighbors in sight, she marked the spot with his tools laid crosswise at the head, and then she climbed into the wagon and refused to leave it. It wasn't a proper wagon house, just an old freight bed, bought second-hand and rigged onto axles from a broken ox cart. Jacob had been fixing it up to carry timber, but it was hers now. The bed was lashed down with rope, lined with straw sacks, wool blankets stitched from scraps. She cut holes in the wall boards for light and wrapped a waxed canvas across the roof beams. Her stove, an old metal box with a cracked flue pipe, was bolted to the corner and vented through a chimney tube she sealed with mud and rags. It smoked when wet. She'd nearly suffocated the first week. That was when they began laughing. Not openly, not all of them, but enough to sting. The Cartwright woman said it first. She thinks she's a turtle, carrying her bedroom around like a shell. Then the storekeeper repeated it in town, and it spread. The rolling bedroom, the bride in the box. It wasn't her they hated. It was the defiance. She should have gone back east, they thought. No family, no child, no home. But she stayed, built a low fence for the goat Jacob had bought, covered the roof with sod to weigh it down, dug a channel under it with a spade she'd bartered for, sloped so the rain would run under and away. When the first light storm came, it held. When the second struck, it bowed but did not break. But what was coming wasn't a passing rain. The signs began a week ahead. Cattle walking oddly, birds flying low and sudden, the sky with that grey edge you could taste on your tongue. Folks talked of old storms, of the one that crushed the McAllister barn 3 winters back, of the wind that had carried a man's outhouse clear across Bitter Creek. But this one felt worse. The wind had a sound to it, far off, but rising, like a train in the sky. She spent the last calm days hammering wedges into the wagon wheels to hold it fast. She stacked rocks at the windward side, and lashed extra canvas over the seams. She moved the stove deeper inside and packed earth along the walls. Then she walked to the gravesite, knelt beside the tools, and placed her palm flat over the cross of metal. "I'm not leaving," she whispered. "You built the start. I'll build the rest." The first night of the storm was the worst in living memory. The wind didn't just howl, it roared. Trees bowed like men praying. Roofs peeled like fruit skins. Even the solid log cabins groaned in the gusts. At the bottom of the valley, fences snapped, and chickens were swept from yards. The schoolhouse lost 1/3 of its shingles. At the Cartwrights, their front door was torn from the hinges, and they had to stack firewood inside to hold it closed. But the bride's rolling bedroom didn't roll. It rocked once, hard, but held. The stones she'd stacked became a windbreak. The wheels braced tight. The straw-stuffed cracks in the wall hissed with air, but no water entered. She sat on her knees beside the stove, face wrapped in a shawl, every muscle clenched like she could hold the whole thing together with her will. By morning, her breath was thick in the air, but her skin was warm. The fire still whispered. Nothing inside was soaked. The storm passed for a day, then returned worse. They say the second night of that storm was the one that took the Harper barn and 3 cows with it. A child from the Redford claim nearly froze when the wind split their shutters. The Goodwin cabin lost its entire roof, and Mr. Goodwin, trying to hold it down with ropes, was tossed into a fence post hard enough to crack 2 ribs. That night, folks didn't sleep. They huddled, they prayed, they stuffed windows with feed sacks and cursed the nails they hadn't hammered deeper in autumn. And across the ridge, in the wagon with the sod-covered roof and cracked stovepipe, the bride burned slow logs through the night and waited for morning. The wind banged at her walls, but they did not open. She wasn't unaware of what they'd said. She'd heard it all. She saw the looks when she came into town, the tight little smiles, the raised eyebrows. She knew the nickname. Box Bride. She carried it like her name. But by the third day of the storm, that laughter had changed. It stopped because folks were desperate now, and some remembered the strange shelter she'd built, how small it was. How snug, how it hadn't leaked, hadn't moaned. By the fourth night, the third blast of the storm came, and with it the real panic. The Cartwright roof gave way. Two of their children were buried under the falling beams, but pulled out, bruised and coughing. The family had nowhere to go. No one did. The Harper family had crowded in with the Millers, 20 people in one room. The stove couldn't heat it. Their breath froze in the air. So Cartwright rode, bareheaded, barely able to speak, and knocked at the wagon door as the wind wailed like a mourning woman. She opened it in silence, already wrapped in blankets, cheeks raw from smoke and cold. He was ashamed, didn't say much. But behind him were his wife, their 3 children, shivering, huddled. She stepped aside. They filed in. The walls creaked all night with the extra weight of bodies inside, and the sound of the storm was worse somehow now that there were more people listening. The Cartwright children huddled near the stove, fingers twitching with thawing pain, skin mottled purple and red where frost had kissed too long. Their mother sobbed quietly into a quilt the bride had sewn from Jacob's old shirts. Cartwright himself sat near the door, jaw clenched, eyes darting at each gust like the wind might reach in and take him next. No one spoke much that night except the youngest girl. She asked if the wagon would roll down the hill. "It's braced," the bride said. "We're safe." They were. The wind knocked, the walls shuddered, but the wagon stood. By morning, 2 more families came. The Branners, whose roof had lifted clean off. Shaw arrived with a baby swaddled in a potato sack, its face hidden beneath layers of damp wool. Behind them, the widow Penner, whose cabin sat in a low grove now half flooded, knocked with her boys in tow. They didn't ask permission. They just looked at her, eyes hollow, and waited for the nod. She gave it. The air inside the wagon turned tight with breath and sweat. Blankets lined the walls now, not just for warmth, but to give the illusion of privacy, though everyone could hear every cough, every sniffle, every rustle of fabric in the dark. The bride passed around the stew pot, filled with what little root vegetables she'd kept buried outside in a clay jar, still frozen when she'd dug them out. She rationed the firewood by half and replaced it with dried buffalo dung and scraps of broken fence posts salvaged weeks earlier. She'd bartered for oil once, back before the first frost, traded an old bonnet for it. Now she used that lamp only at night, and only for minutes. "You're mad," Mrs. Branner whispered when she'd seen her stockpiling fence wood back in October. "You think you'll burn your fence for heat?" The bride hadn't answered. She had. The wagon should not have fit 10 people. But people compress in a storm. They shrink into themselves, stack into corners, sleep like sandbags. At night, the bride rotated positions. Some slept while others sat. Then they'd switch. Every hour, she rose, checked the fire, opened the stove, and placed in whatever could burn. Ashes piled beside it in a tin pan. The stove, patched with metal and rags, coughed once every hour, but stayed hot. No one laughed anymore. Out the small window, the valley looked gone. The white wasn't just snow, it was mist and ice, wind and flurries, a solid wall of movement. You couldn't see a tree past 20 feet. One man wandered off to find his livestock. No one saw him again. A woman 2 claims over died of smoke when her chimney collapsed inward, and the fire tried to breathe through the floorboards. And still the wagon held. On the 6th night, it cracked, a sound like a bone splitting. A roof beam, under pressure, half rotted, groaning from days of wind stress. The Cartwright boy cried out. The men scrambled. Cartwright and Branner pressed their backs against the wall to brace it. The bride moved faster than anyone. She crawled through the blankets, reached the outside hatch, and climbed out into the storm. She disappeared into white. Penner screamed for her to return, but the bride had seen the split coming. So she'd reinforced most of the frame already with extra braces, timbers salvaged from Jacob's failed cabin, iron nails hammered in with a rock when her mallet broke. But that one spot had sagged from the first snow. She climbed to it, rope in hand, and lashed a second timber to the beam from the outside, hands freezing as she pulled the cord tight. The snow stung her eyes. She spit blood from her lip where the wind had cracked it. She jammed in 2 wedges, hammered them in with the base of her lantern. The roof stopped groaning. She fell back into the wagon an hour later, half blind, hair stiff with frost. Mrs. Cartwright helped her peel the gloves off. 2 fingertips were blackening. "Why would you do that?" the woman asked. The bride didn't speak. She was already untying her boots. She crawled into the blankets again, curled around the youngest child, and closed her eyes. It wasn't until the next morning that someone finally said it out loud. "You saved us," Branner muttered. "If we'd stayed put, hell, the smoke, my baby, we wouldn't have made it." Cartwright nodded, slowly. "This wagon, it's tighter than my house ever was." The bride didn't answer. She was outside again by then, tending to the stovepipe, clearing snow away from the base. She worked slowly now, her left hand mostly numb. But the wagon, her bedroom, stood. When she came back in, she paused at the threshold. The others had cleared a place near the stove. A blanket was already spread for her. Someone had placed her iron kettle on the heat, ready. She nodded and stepped inside. The storm lasted 9 days. On the 10th, the sun came like a promise no one believed. Just a grey smear of light through cloud, barely strong enough to cast shadows. But the wind dropped, the snow eased, and the world began to reappear. Trees, fences, the hint of cabins, broken and bent. The survivors emerged. They found the church roof half-caved, the store shuttered, its sign gone. The only place untouched was the strange little wagon on the ridge, wrapped in ropes and canvas, roof padded with sod, pipe still smoking. Inside, children played cards with threadbare hands. The baby in the potato sack had learned to gurgle. The bride sat by the stove, her damaged fingers wrapped in cloth, her eyes closed, rocking gently. They had survived. They spoke little of what had happened in that wagon in the weeks that followed, not from shame, but because something sacred had happened, something held. It hadn't broken. The storm had taken so much, but not them, not the bride. Weeks later, when the thaw came, a man from the county came riding up the trail, a surveyor sent to assess damages for the Railway Commission. He took notes, sketched the ruins, spoke with survivors. He reached the ridge last. "Is that a moving house?" he asked, surprised. "No," Cartwright said, stepping beside him. "That's her home. She built it herself." "She did," said Branner, standing behind him. "You wouldn't believe what it's made of. Some kind of joke, I heard," said the surveyor, flipping pages. "A rolling bedroom, they called it." "Not anymore," said Penner, stepping forward. "Now they call it something else." The man raised an eyebrow. "What?" Cartwright answered. "We call it the warmest place west of the ridge." The surveyor chuckled. "What's her name?" No one answered, until a child's voice said simply, "The bride." And that somehow was enough. The thaw came in spits and sputters. First a softening of the top snow layer, then a sudden collapse of crusts around tree trunks and fence posts. The rivers cracked open like bones popping from cold joints. And then mud, endless mud, slick and grey, swallowing boots, dragging broken branches into its belly, drowning the frozen memory of storm days in a reeking flood of thaw rot. The bride's wagon sat like a rock on a rise now surrounded by shallow melt pools, the sod roof greening at the corners, the flue still faintly trailing smoke. A new door had been fixed to the front, proper hinges now, salvage from a collapsed barn. Branner had installed it, unasked. Cartwright brought lumber for new roof bracing. And Penner gifted her 2 panes of thick glass taken from her own wrecked window shutters. The bride had said nothing when they offered help, only stepped aside and let them work. She'd never asked for a thing. But now, in the hush that followed the storm, the valley's survivors began returning again and again, not for shelter now, but for advice. "How do you pack that mud around the flue so it don't catch fire? What did you use to seal them seams under the roof? You say you braced the wheels? How?" One by one, the men who'd laughed now stood outside with caps in hand, asking how she'd made her bedroom into a house that stood where theirs had cracked, bowed, or failed altogether. The women brought bundles, dried meat, buttons, cloth, and left them at her step. The children no longer looked away. She wasn't just a novelty now. She was the only one who had planned ahead for disaster. They began calling it the Ridge Room, not in mockery, not anymore. It was a strange nickname, born from pride, whispered at the store counter like a spell. "You didn't hear? Cartwright's family survived in the Ridge Room. Whole thing stood through the winds." Eventually, someone sketched it. A visiting preacher from San Miguel, traveling through the back trails weeks after the freeze, heard the tale secondhand and stopped to see it for himself. When he did, he stared long, stepping around the perimeter in silence, and then sat in the mud and sketched the thing with charcoal and paper. The bride didn't know what to make of him. He spoke only once. "It's honest," he said. "Most houses aren't." She didn't reply. He left the sketch behind. She nailed it up inside. A single charcoal line showed the little wagon, sod roof, smoke puffing from its metal flue, and under it, one word written in a preacher's careful script: endurance. That spring was slow and cruel. The creek ran high and flooded the southern trail, cutting off trade for weeks. The store's shelves grew thin. Nails became precious again. A single pane of glass could be bartered for a pound of flour. Everyone planted late. Calves were lost. The miller's cow miscarried from malnutrition. But the bride's goat birthed twins. And when the snow fully melted, revealing the mess it had buried, folks finally walked through the valley and reckoned with what was gone. Half the cabins needed full rebuilds. Tools had rusted. Plows warped, water barrels split wide from frost pressure. Only the ridge room remained as it was. Branner came first. None early one morning, hat in hand, face flushed. "I'd like to build something like yours. Not exact, but close." Could you show me the frame? She led him around the perimeter, pointed out the beam he'd replaced himself, how she'd braced it with side planks, and woven rope to keep it from shifting. She showed how she'd dug a slight depression under the south edge to redirect meltwater, how the stove flue bent twice to warm more air before releasing smoke. Cartwright came next. He asked about her bedding, how she'd kept the straw from molding. Then Penner, who wanted to know about the insulation. Soon others came with paper, pencils, questions. She didn't speak often, but she showed them. She walked them around it, opened the stove, peeled back blankets to reveal seams and frames, held up firewood sticks to show what burned fastest, what longest. She handed them rags soaked in wax, showing how she sealed the cracks. By June, 3 new shelters went up modeled after hers. Not wagons, not rolling, but compact, tight, lined in rags and straw, flues that curled like hers, roofs sealed with mud and canvas. They called them storm houses. Some said they'd build them next to their main cabins. Others whispered they might just move into them entirely. The girl in the wagon had survived something the valley had never seen, and the memory of it, sharp and cold, had taken root like a thorn in every homesteader's spine. No one said it aloud, but everyone feared the next storm, not if, when. By late summer, something else shifted. The widow Penner, always sharp-tongued and proud, invited the bride to join her at quilting. It was said casually, as if it were nothing. But everyone noticed. The other women made space on the benches. They asked where she'd come from, what her maiden name had been, whether she had sisters back east. She answered as little as she needed, but stayed, even helped sew. Then came the preacher from Burnt Fork, asking her to speak at the meeting house, just for a few minutes, about her shelter. She refused, twice. On the third request, she nodded, stood in front of the 20 people crammed into the half-rebuilt chapel, and held up the same rope she'd used to wedge the wheel in place. "This saved my life," she said. "It wasn't strong, but it was tight." Then she sat. No one said another word that evening. That fall a stranger came. He wore a bowler hat and city boots, stiff like they hadn't met mud in months. Said he worked for a paper back east. Asked around the store for anyone who'd lived through the valley storm. He meant to write a piece, he said, about the real grit of frontier survival. "Go talk to the bride," someone said. He did. She didn't invite him inside, but she stood outside the wagon and let him ask his questions. "How'd you come to be here?" "My husband brought me." "Is he home?" "He died." "And the shelter? It's your design?" "No," she said. "It's what I had." He asked more questions, pushing, scribbling in his notebook. And when she finally waved him off, he tried one last thing. "Can I take your picture beside it?" She stared, then shook her head. He left. The story was written anyway. It came west by rail in a month, passed from hand to hand. Someone read it aloud at the store. They'd printed her words wrong, called her Emily Rensley, which wasn't her name, and called the shelter a makeshift rolling bedroom designed by a brave widow. They didn't understand it, not really, but they remembered it. That winter, 5 new ridge-style homes were built in the next county. All of them had fixed wheels. None of them were laughed at. The storm had changed the land, but the bride had changed what survival looked like. By the second winter, everything had changed, except the ridge room. It still stood on the rise above the melting bend in the creek, sod roof now patched with fresh thatch, pipe darkened from another season of smoke. But the bride who lived inside it was no longer the stranger in the valley. She had become a reference point, a benchmark, a kind of quiet measuring stick no one admitted aloud, but all watched. When newcomers arrived that fall, dragging bent carts or driving livestock with cracked whips and hollow eyes, it was not the preacher or the Cartwrights they were pointed toward first. It was her. "You see that wagon on the ridge?" folks would say. "Go there. She'll tell you what'll stand through the freeze." Some of them didn't believe it at first, until they climbed the muddy rise and saw the thing for themselves. It didn't look like much. Still didn't. Just a box on wheels, ringed with rock and rope, framed in wood grayer than ash, metal stove still breathing. But something about the way it sat, unbothered, solid, unaffected, told the real story. That winter, 7 families built homes like it, not exact copies. No one could build like she had, not without the desperation she'd had. But they studied her design, tight, low to the ground, cross-braced, with a double wall in the windward direction, and a roof slope that shed snow like a second skin. Some even built theirs over wheel axles for luck. And it wasn't just homes now. It was storage barns, root cellars, windbreaks, chicken shelters modeled after the ridge room's profile. Someone even joked that they ought to carve her face into a coin and start trading in ridge dollars. No one laughed. The bride, who still hadn't offered her name freely, spoke more now, but only when it was needed. When the young miller girl burned her hand on an open flame, it was the bride who wrapped it in her salve of lard and pine ash. When a new couple from Arkansas found their roof leaking mid-December, it was the bride who walked barefoot through snow to their door with a patching tin and 2 ropes. When the schoolteacher asked for help insulating the walls, the bride brought old rag bundles and showed how to soak them in lye water to repel mice. She gave without being asked, but she never expected thanks. One evening, just before the solstice, the town gathered for a supper inside the new storehouse. Bare beams, still open to the air in places, but warm with bodies. Someone passed a plate of molasses biscuits and made a toast. "To the bride," they said, and every hand raised. She wasn't even in the room. She was outside, patching a flap on her stovepipe. It was late that second winter when the boy arrived. He was small, maybe 9 or 10, with bruises under both eyes and a coat that didn't reach his wrists. He didn't knock, just stood there at the base of the ridge room's steps, holding a parcel under one arm and staring at the smoke. The bride saw him through the window. She opened the door but said nothing. He didn't look up. "They said you'd know what to do." She gestured him inside. He stayed 3 days before he spoke again. She fed him beans and goat's milk, wrapped his feet in fresh cloth, never asked his name. On the 4th morning, as she stoked the fire and he watched from his bedroll, he finally said it. "My mother died." The bride didn't stop what she was doing. "My uncle hit her." Then he left. The storm came a day later. Still the bride did not turn. "I carried this." He reached into his coat and pulled out the parcel. It was wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. She took it, opened it slowly. It was a cracked photograph in a wooden frame. His mother and father, maybe, arms around each other. One smiling, one not. "I thought it would break," the boy whispered. She knelt beside him and wrapped the photograph again, tighter. "It didn't," she said. Neither had he. By spring, the boy was known to all. He didn't speak often, wore the same battered boots, but he followed the bride everywhere, hauled firewood, cleaned the stove, learned how to pack rags into window seams, how to test snow density before it buried the roof too deep, how to mark storm lines with string so no one got lost in a whiteout. Someone asked once if she'd adopted him. She didn't answer, but when the teacher asked him his name for the roll book, he said, "Jacob." The room went quiet. He didn't know it, but that was the name of her husband. It didn't seem to matter. She nodded, and it was his name from then on. Another storm came the 3rd winter. It was smaller, meaner in some ways. Wet snow, not dry, heavy as stone, collapsed 6 barns, but the ridge room held again, and now it wasn't alone. 13 houses, built in its likeness, weathered the winds. Not one fell, not one family was lost. The church burned down from a lantern accident that spring. The town rebuilt it, but smaller. The ridge room never changed. Then came the man in the wagon. No one knew him. He rode in with a sour-looking horse and a wagon covered in patched canvas. He asked after the ridge bride, and when someone pointed up the hill, he nodded once and said, "About time." He'd come from Kansas, or said so. Said his cousin had written about a woman who turned a freight cart into a fortress. Said he'd built traveling wagons before, and that if she had any brains, she'd help him design them proper. "We'll sell them," he grinned, "as storm beds, rolling bedrooms for the wild-hearted. You name it, we can be rich." The bride didn't even let him inside. She stood outside the ridge room, arms folded, boy beside her, and waited for him to finish. "I ain't leaving without your design," he said finally. "That's how it works. You survive something and folks want to buy it. That's fair." She stared at him, then looked down at the boy. Then she said, in a voice clear and still, "You can't buy what's earned," and she turned her back. He left the next morning. No one saw which way he went, but someone found his wagon 2 days later, stuck in mud, axle snapped, no sign of him. The ridge room's shadow had grown long. By the 5th year, people forgot the bride had ever been laughed at. They told new stories now. About how the ridge room once held 10 souls against the fiercest wind the valley had ever known. About how it burned warmer than cabins twice its size. About how the woman who built it never gave her name, but gave everything else. And about the boy who'd come with a broken photograph and stayed. No one called it foolish now. Some even said the ridge room would outlast them all. And maybe it would, because as that 5th winter crept over the ridge, snow dragging itself down like a curtain, the ridge room stood once more, silent, ready. The smoke curled from its pipe, and inside, the bride placed the photograph on the shelf above the stove, just beneath the preacher's old charcoal sketch. One said endurance, the other only faces, but both told the same story. Years passed. 3, then 5, then nearly 10. The ridge room still stood. The wheels beneath it had long since been buried under packed earth and stone, the ground rising slowly as the valley settled into its seasons. Grass grew high around its base now, a soft green wave in summer, brittle frost whitened in winter. The canvas she once lashed over the roof had long been replaced with fitted timber and fresh sod. The stovepipe had been reforged twice, its base bolted into a stone ring Jacob, the boy, had built with his own hands by the time he turned 16. No one called it a wagon anymore. It was a home, and it was the oldest structure in the valley still standing. Most of the cabins that had risen in its shadow had fallen or been rebuilt. Logs rot, roofs sag, families leave, but the ridge room stayed, not untouched. Nothing in the west was, but unbroken, untouched by collapse, untouched by doubt. They'd stopped calling her the bride somewhere around the 6th year, though no one really remembered when. To the younger children who'd grown up in the valley after the great storm, she was just Mrs. Rensley, though she'd never offered the name. The name, in truth, had come from Jacob, when he'd written it in the snow one morning, tracing it out beside the ridge room's door with the end of a stick. "I want us to be called that," he'd said. She hadn't argued. She hadn't needed to. In her silence, he found permanence. The winters had grown softer, or so it seemed. Storms still came, but not with the same teeth, and the valley had changed. New families brought new lumber, new saws. A rail spur had been promised more than once. A real church now stood at the crossing road, and the store had glass windows with hand-painted signs. The children went to lessons 5 days a week, and someone started calling it a town. But every winter, without fail, someone still asked her how to build for the cold. She never gave a lecture. She didn't stand on boxes or speak in groups. But if you brought her a plank, she'd show you where to place the notch. If you asked about airflow, she'd walk with you to your chimney, crouch with a knife in hand, and etch a diagram in the snow. She didn't take money, wouldn't. Once, a traveling trader offered her $10 for a drawing of the ridge room's design. She sent him away without a word. "What's it worth?" a boy had asked her once, curious. If someone made 1,000 of them, she'd just look toward the hills where Jacob's father was buried, then down at the stick of firewood in her hand. "What it costs to make?" she said. "Can't be counted in dollars." The third time fire came to the town, it came from lightning. A bolt struck the Cartwright roof in mid-autumn. Dry leaves piled too high on the eaves. The blaze moved fast. Flames leapt from house to barn to chicken coop in minutes, faster than buckets could be filled. Smoke filled the basin. A wind caught the sparks and flung them like nails toward the trees. Children screamed. Livestock scattered. Someone rang the church bell, but no one knew why. And then someone shouted, "To the ridge!" It was Branner, white-haired now, limping, but loud as ever. "To the ridge room!" And they came, not just the children, not just the weak or the old, but everyone, with buckets, with quilts, with arms full of possessions. They ran uphill, not away from town, but toward the one place they all trusted to still be standing when the smoke cleared. She saw them coming, all of them, and she opened the door. The ridge room held 32 people that night, more than ever before. They packed in like wheat in a sack, air thin and thick with heat and breath and panic. She and Jacob cracked the top slats to let out smoke and pulled water from a barrel stashed in a hollow under the floor, an old trick she'd learned from a Comanche widow long ago. They soaked cloth and stuffed the seams, let the heat pass through, but not the fire. Outside, the sky glowed orange. Inside, the stove was cold, but the people were safe. When dawn came, the town was ash, but the ridge room stood, blackened on one side, a few boards scorched, but intact. Someone counted noses. No one had been lost. A girl cried, not from fear, but from awe. "Why doesn't it burn?" she asked. "Why doesn't it fall?" No one answered. But the bride, Mrs. Rensley, took the cloth from her hands, wrung it dry, and looked toward the town, then said, "Because it was built by someone who'd already lost everything once." That was the only answer, and it was true. Years later, they asked if she'd leave. She didn't. They offered her land in the new square, a house even, built by the community. She smiled once, then returned to her patching. They asked Jacob if he wanted to move to the rail line town up north. He was 21 now, strong, quiet like her, but kind. He looked up at the ridge room, at the place that had taken him in when the world spat him out. "I already live in the best place there is," he said. And he did. They all did. Because the ridge room was more than shelter now. It was legend. It was memory, made solid. The last time she saw snow, she was alone again. Jacob had gone to help with the new school. A woman had brought bread the night before, and she'd eaten some by the stove, then pulled her shawl over her shoulders and watched the moon cast frost silver on the rise. That morning, she didn't rise. They found her curled near the stove, hands folded, photograph still in its frame above her head. She hadn't died in the bed. She'd died on the floor, by the fire, exactly where she'd lived. There was no funeral, not really, just the whole town, every soul, climbing the ridge in silence. They didn't bury her. They placed her inside and sealed the ridge room shut. No one dared live in it after that. They let it stand. It still stands. Tourists walk by sometimes now, guided by descendants and old-timers with weathered maps. They look at the wooden walls, the blackened chimney, the wheels half buried in soil. "Why didn't they move it?" they ask. "Why didn't anyone take it down?" The answer never changes, because it survived everything. And above the door, etched in the wood now, carved by a hand long gone but remembered still, are two words: rolling bedroom, a joke once, now a monument, not to design, not to cleverness, but to the woman who, when she had nothing, built something that refused to fall, something that held, something that endured.